bring 1 year to a close and prepare to start a new one. We're feeling that we're blessed for our health and our homes, our ability to come together in a free country and work on problems. We pray that you'll continue to bless this board, the employees of the county, the families that make decisions that are in your best interest. And we pray as always that you'll forgive us our sins and shortcomings and walk open the prayer for us as we proceed through our day in Christ. Amen.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Call the meeting to order. Lance, would you do the roll call, please?
Commissioner Pitts.
Here.
Commissioner Toller.
Here.
Commissioner Miller.
Here.
Commissioner Gould.
Here.
Mr. Foster is absent.
We have one set of minutes to approve. Regular meeting held December 14th, 2018. I'll make a motion to approve. I'll second.
Commissioner Pitts.
Yes.
Commissioner Toller.
Yes.
Commissioner Miller.
Yes.
Commissioner Gould.
Yes. We have no building permits this morning. County finances, we're still working on redoing how that's going to be presented. That will be coming soon. No old business that I'm aware of. Moving on, new business. Need to approve the payment of bills. I'll second. Got one page, that's great.
Commissioner Pitts.
Yes.
Commissioner Toller.
Yes.
Commissioner Gould.
Yes.
Commissioner Miller.
Yes. Have the 2017 Union County audit. City accounting firm is going to present the facts and findings and tell us all about it.
Good morning. I'm Megan Cochran, and Chad Lucas is the partner on the engagement. I just wanted to thank you for the opportunity to work on the audit this year, and very thankful to Angie. I'll go through the annual financial report first, the large packet. Beginning on page 1, we have our independent auditor's report, providing our opinion over the financial statements to make sure that they're presented in accordance with generally accepted accounting principles. On page 2, we have a qualified opinion over the governmental activities. For the qualified opinion, we didn't have sufficient documentation for the net pension obligation in accordance with GASB Statement 45, accounting and financial reporting by employers for post-employment benefits other than pensions. So we've recommended for 2018 to have an actuarial valuation to determine what the net pension or the net OPEB liability should be. For all of the other opinion units for the funds, we have an unmodified opinion. Everything was fairly stated. Beginning on page 4 is the financial statements, the statement of net position. This includes all your activities of the county, all of the funds. It includes your capital assets, your long-term debt, and your net pension liability, compensated absences. So for your overall, you had a total net position of 1.4 million. Included in that is negative 2.9 million in your net investment in capital assets. Your long-term debt balances exceeded the capital assets that you purchased with that debt. And then included in the net position is restrictions, third-party restrictions, statutory restrictions for different highways and streets, health and welfare, public safety, your retirement, and then everything else that's remaining is unrestricted. Included on these financial statements is also your component unit, your emergency telephone systems board. Beginning on page 6 is your statement of activities for all of your activity in the county. This is a slightly different presentation than you're probably used to seeing. We're required to show the expenses by function, and then we show the various revenues by function. And the general revenues, your property taxes, your sales tax, your income tax. So overall, you had a positive change in net position of 300,000. But we also had prior period adjustments and adjustments to prior year financial statements of 400,000. So your net position decreased from the prior year to about 1.4 million. And we have additional details for those prior period adjustments further in the footnotes. Beginning on page 7 is the balance sheet for your governmental fund. So it breaks out your general fund and your major funds, your IMRF fund, your bond and interest fund, and then all of your other funds are grouped into your non-major governmental fund column. And we have additional detail. It breaks up all of the non-major governmental funds starting on page 71. So we show the detail for each of those funds. Page 8 is your reconciliation of the governmental funds to your net position. So in your governmental funds, you don't report your capital assets, you don't report your long-term debt, compensated absences. So we show a reconciliation from your fund financial statements to your government-wide, including those capital assets, those long-term debt balances, and your compensated absences balances. Page 9 is your statement of revenues, expenditures, and changes in your fund balance. So your general fund had a net change. You had a loss of 121,000. Your IMRF fund had an increase of 35. Your bond and interest had an increase of 115. And all of your other non-major funds had a loss of 451. And then included in each of those funds, we have prior period adjustments for those funds as well, and that detail is also included in the footnotes. Page 11 for your statement of net position of proprietary funds. This includes your internal service funds, your funds that you have that you're using to charge services to other departments. So your county fuel fund and your employee benefit fund are included as internal service funds and included in this financial statement. The detail for each of those funds are included further back, starting on page 93. So I think this is a little different presentation than what you've seen in prior years. Yeah. So page 12 just includes the statement of revenues and expenses and changes in those two funds. So it shows your charges for services that you charge to the other funds, the other department, and then those expenses, your fuel purchases or your health insurance. It looks like you had a loss of $8,000 this year. Page 13 is the statement of cash flows, just showing how the cash was used or received in those two funds. Beginning on page 14 is your statement of fiduciary net position for your fiduciary funds. Those just include your agency funds. Those are funds that you're holding on behalf of others. You're either collecting fees or taxes that are being paid to other entities. The detail for those agency funds are starting on page 96. So starting on page 15 is your notes to the financial statements. Footnote 1 is your significant accounting policies, and that provides a little more detail of what makes up those balances on your financial statements. What your page 23. The rest of the footnotes includes additional information over your deposits and your investment balances, your capital assets, your increases, your capital asset additions during the year, your disposals of capital assets to get to your ending balance. Footnote 4 goes into more detail over your long-term debt, describes your general obligation bonds, any bond covenants that you have, the maturities of those long-term bonds over the next years, your capital lease obligations, any capital leases that you've purchased, and what balances are outstanding for those. And then on page 30, in your long-term debt footnote, we show your activity. So we show your balance of the long-term debt at the end of the year. We show any additions, any debt that was in place this year, and any debt and any payments you've made over the debt during the year to get to your ending balance. On page 7, or on page 31, footnote 7, we go into all of the required disclosures for your IMRF, for your net pension liability. That information includes all of your pensions, your regular, your elected officials IMRF fund, and your sheriff's law enforcement personnel IMRF fund. And that includes your plan membership, the numbers of members that are currently in the plan, that have retired, that are receiving benefits from the plan. And then it shows your change in your net pension liability by each of the funds. So it looks like in your regular net pension liability, you had 1.5 million. Elected officials is 109,000, and your sheriff is 668,000. I think 2 of the net pension liabilities actually decreased from the prior year. And sometimes that just depends on the market. Page 8 goes into a little more detail on your other post-employment benefits, what your policies are, what you contribute for the retirees, and what they're required to contribute to stay on the health insurance plan. Page 48 has the prior period adjustments, and we scheduled out the different prior period adjustment types that we identified during the audit. We noted some of the accounts receivable balances are misstated the prior year, the accounts payable balances. We also had a revenue fund. They were either an agency fund or they were a clearing fund and wouldn't be included in the non-major governmental funds and the governmental activities. Beginning on page 50 is your required supplementary information, and this includes some additional detail over your pensions, what the actuarially determined contribution is, and what you contributed to the plans. I believe for all of the pension funds, whatever IMRF determined the actuarial contribution was, you made those contributions during the year. Page 53 and 54 and 55 provide a little more detail over the calculation for the pension liabilities. And then page 57 or page 56 and 57 provide your budget to actual for your major special revenue funds. So for your general fund and for your IMRF fund. Starting on page 61 is your combining and your individual fund statements. So it includes your budget versus actual for your bond and interest fund. And then it provides detail for your general fund. That's made up of your general fund, your compensated absences fund, and your general fund reserve. And then starting on page 71, as I said, provides more detail for the non-major governmental funds. So it shows your special revenue funds and your capital project funds. And through the next few pages, detail your assets and your liabilities and your revenue and expense funds. So you can see the activity for those funds. And then on page, starting up, we showed those budget versus actual spreadsheets for each of those funds. Page 93 is the breakout of your internal service funds. It shows your county fuel fund and your employee benefit fund. And then starting on page 96, that shows your breakout of your agency funds. And I know that I'm going through this kind of quickly, so if you have any questions as you look through this later on or in more detail, feel free to reach out to us and ask us any questions. Page 101 has our auditor report over on internal controls over financial reporting and compliance in accordance with government auditing standards. So the first page just kind of explains the definition of deficiencies in internal controls and material weaknesses. But there's a reasonable possibility that a material misstatement may exist in the financial statements and may not be prevented or detected and corrected on a timely basis. We identified 3 material weaknesses, which I'll go into more detail. And then we also identified 3 significant deficiencies. But they don't rise, they're not as severe as a material weakness, but yet important enough that we want to communicate those to those charged with governance. And then we noted 1 finding in regards to non-compliance with laws and regulations. So starting on page 103, that provides a little more detail to the findings that we identified, the criteria and the condition, our recommendations, and then the auditing responses to those findings. So the first one is internal control over financial reporting. The internal controls over presenting the financial statements in accordance with GAAP. If we identify any material weaknesses or prior period adjustments, we're required to include this finding.
Can you go through these in a little bit more detail, so everybody knows what we're talking about here and what our response is to?
Oh, yeah.
Plan
Yeah.
to fix this?
So we're recommending that the county improve control over these transactions so that they're reported in accordance with GAAP. So any adjustments that relate to accruals or any adjustments be reported before the audit process. So, and then, the response is that the county administrator will review each of the recommended journal entries and start the year-end review procedures with the assistance of the county treasurer. So. The second finding relates to the lack of completed personnel records. I know that with county and decentralization, a lot of times the personnel records might be maintained within those departments themselves, but sometimes you run the risk of not having completed records in accordance with any of the federal or state regulations. So we're recommending that the county maintain all of these personnel records in a central, secure location. And to audit those files to make sure that you have all of the required documentation for each employee. Response is that you will review everything. Everything is included in those files.
And the central location is the HR.
Yes, correct. Finding 3 is the lack of segregation of duties. So we identified instances where employees have access to financial records and or assets of the county. I think the departments for the sheriff's department and the circuit clerk office, where employees have the ability to collect receipts, they can make deposits, they perform the bank reconciliations, they're authorized signers of the accounts, and they're responsible for distributing the checks. So we recommend that the county evaluate their procedures to determine if any of those procedures could be divided up to other individuals and some of those abilities removed. So not one person has the ability to do everything within the process. And I believe that the county will be requesting to work with the departments, with the sheriff and the circuit clerk to evaluate their processes to determine what changes can be made to remove the segregation of duties issue. Finding 4 is the inadequate bank reconciliation procedures. So we noted that bank reconciliations were not being performed for accounts maintained in the county clerk's office. The accounts are not included in the accounting software. And then for a couple of the bank reconciliations, we noted where the accounts did not agree to the cash balance reported in the accounting software. So our recommendation is that the any bank accounts that are held in the county's name be reconciled and agree to cash balances maintained in the accounting software or any records maintained at the department, So I believe that the county will be working with the county clerk to reconcile those bank accounts on a monthly basis and provide those reconciliations to the treasurer's office. And then they'll also, I believe the sheriff's department and the circuit clerk also maintain bank accounts outside of the treasurer. So I believe they're going to work with them to make sure that they get copies of those to verify that the reconciliations are being performed.
I might interject here, we have asked for those at various times from different offices, so.
Okay.
Been refused.
Which I believe they're all county funds, so probably a good idea to make sure that they have processes to oversee those account balances.
And ultimately, we are responsible for it.
Finding 5 is inadequate controls over fines and fees assessed by the court. So during the audit, we noted that certain fines or fees were not properly assessed by the circuit court in accordance with Illinois compiled statutes. So our recommendation is to implement a review process to make sure that all the fines are assessed in accordance with the statutes. I know that there's always a number of fines that are being set up and established and potentially changing, and so we just recommend that a process be in place to monitor those changes. And I believe that the county's going to work with the circuit clerk and the state's attorney to develop that review process to make sure that they're being reviewed periodically to make sure that they are being assessed.
Could you determine if that affected our revenue source because of the change? The lack of the change?
Yeah, so we have identified the specific fines and fees within the audit of how they're impacted. We do have samples, so we can't not necessarily know a dollar amount, but we can identify which type of fines were impacted. And let's see. This is also included in the circuit court's report. A couple of them were the court system maintenance, which I believe comes to the county. The Violent Crime Victims Assistance Fund, the state's attorney fees, and the serious traffic violation. There's an additional fee of $35 that's charged to those accounts that I don't believe was collected during the years. And I can provide a more comprehensive list as well. Finding 6 is the noncompliance with the debt covenant. The bonds that are currently being held by the county requires an audit to be started within 180 and 210 days after the close of the fiscal year end. And so we recommend that the county establish an audit within the required time frame. And with the auditee response, I know that there were some issues with the timing of the audits, and that shouldn't be the impact going forward. And then the last finding is the inadequate time and attendance reporting. So we noted that the county offices maintain their own processes for tracking time and attendance records for payroll reporting, and provide either a summary or detailed information for those pay periods to the Human Resources Office to do the calculation of the payroll. But some of that summary information that's provided isn't adequate to comply with all the federal and state reporting requirements. So that we recommend that the county establish a process to provide those detailed records needed so that the Human Resources Office can calculate that payroll in accordance with federal and state requirements. And I believe that the county in 2019, you're working to implement time clocks, so that should have all of that information available.
Hopefully that'll happen this year. And again, as you can see in our response, that we did ask for information.
Yes, I know, and being decentralized, you have some offices that provide all of that information, and you have some that provide a different format, and trying to work and get everyone to provide all of the necessary information. And then the last page on 110 just has a schedule of the findings, the prior year findings, and whether the items were not repeated or repeated. Some of the items that aren't repeated, they weren't included as a material weakness or a significant deficiency, but we might have some recommendations for those processes or for those policies, things that we recommend that would be helpful. And those recommendations are included in the auditor's communication to the county board and management. should be the next report. This includes some different information. Starting on page 2, we have some required communication that we're to present to those charged with governments based upon our auditing standards. Discussions on corrected and uncorrected misstatements, management representation, required supplementary information, and then beginning on page 6, we included the audit adjustments that were made during the audit process. I believe those go through page 22. I believe overall we had about 48, 49, so audit adjustments. And a portion of those are relating more to our accruals. I know you guys report on a cash basis during the year, so some of the adjustments relate on reporting those accounts payable balances at the end of the fiscal year or the accounts receivable balances. Starting on page 23, those are adjustments that were determined to pass on. They weren't material. They weren't materially misstating the financial statements. I think that a lot of those those also relate to accrual activity, misstatements to prior year accounts payable or accounts receivables. Starting on page 25 is our discussion over the recommendations, the control deficiencies or comments or recommendations that we have to the county. The first one relates to capital assets. The county doesn't maintain a centralized capital asset listing for all of the capital assets. So we recommend that you develop a policy for tracking those capital assets and setting up a process to keep that listing. I know that can vary. You can have an accounting system, you can have a fixed asset module that tracks it. I think that some of the entities, some municipalities track it in Excel. So I know that sometimes you have to weigh the cost benefit to what works best for you. Unclaimed property, we noted during our testing of cash that there were outstanding checks greater than the unclaimed property reporting period. So we recommend that those departments work to make sure that they're reporting all of those unclaimed checks to the state treasurer. We have another comment in regards to capital assets. I believe that you don't have a formal capitalization policy, but I believe in the budget it talks about the capitalization threshold being 500. Government Finance Officers Association recommends normally that it not be less than 5,000. So when establishing a formal capitalization policy, we recommend that you kind of evaluate that and see if that's the threshold that you want to use or a different threshold. The lease agreements, during our testing of the lease agreements, we noted that the county doesn't have a policy regarding the board's approval for lease agreements before they're entered into by the various departments. So we recommend that an approval process be in place to approve those. And then we also recommend that the leases are analyzed before the end of the fiscal year to identify whether they're capital or reporting leases, because depending on the lease type, it will determine how to report those in the financial statements.
We have recognized several times, and we don't have a policy, and we will soon, but we've asked departments to, work with this, and again, they go out and do their own lease.
Right.
You know.
But it's the county, yeah, county money and, yeah. The next one is the fund balance and reserve policy. GASB statement number 54 provided some additional detail over fund balance classifications and the reporting. And so we recommend that the county develop a policy or procedures over those fund balance reporting guidelines. And I provided Angie a couple of example policies for those. The next one is the accounting procedures manual. The county doesn't currently have a consolidated accounting procedures manual. And so we normally recommend that one be in place. You know, elected officials change, employees change, and so you want to have something to document those policies and procedures so that if there is turnover, they can easily get a handle on their roles and what processes they need to do in those departments. Timely cash deposits. We noted some time lags between the date the money was received by the county and the date that the funds were deposited into the, I believe it's the two accounts that are not held by the treasurer, they're held by the county clerk. So we recommend that the cash be deposited at the date of the receipt or as soon as possible to improve the cash flow of those accounts. The next one is for the hotel and motel tax audits. The county receives taxes on the lease or rent of rooms in your monthly tax returns. So since the tax is self-reported by the taxpayer, we recommend that the county consider auditing some of those entities to make sure that they're reporting those taxes correctly.
Can we do that?
Yes, I believe in the ordinance that was that set up these the tax, it specifically notes that you could go and audit those books of records.
Periodically, we have checked online their occupancy rates and seen that it was not what we were getting.
Right,
So,
right. But yes, I believe the ordinance specifically discusses that. An information technology disaster recovery plan. We recommend, the county doesn't currently have a formal recovery plan, so we recommend that the county document those procedures. Work with your IT consultant to document those procedures. And then in the recommendation, we identify some of the areas that it should address. We also recommend that the county establish a formal documented computer policies and procedures. And we include a couple of different items to consider in that procedures manual. And then we also recommend that the county establish a formal policy regarding the backup of your computer files, your programs, and your operating systems. I believe you're already doing this. You are backing up your information, but we just recommend that you document that process and you have that policy so you know that your backups are being performed in accordance with your requirements. And then starting on page 32, we identify future accounting pronouncements that may have an impact on the county. These are standards that are required to be implemented in future years. Doesn't necessarily mean that every policy or every standard applies to what you currently have at the county, but just information to keep in mind. And then the last report that relates to 2017 is the financial and compliance audit of the clerk of the circuit court's fiduciary fund. So this report is required by the administrative office for the Illinois courts. So our report includes our independent auditor's report over the financial statements of the fiduciary funds. We had an unmodified opinion for that report. Starting on page 4, we have our audit report on internal control over financial reporting and on compliance and other matters in accordance with government auditing standards. And within the circuit clerk, we identified 2 material weaknesses that I'll go through in more detail. And we identified 1 significant deficiency. Starting on page 6, we have the statement of fiduciary net position. For the circuit clerk, with their assets include cash, and then within that cash, it's made up of liabilities due to others or due to other funds within the county. Page 7 includes the notes to the financial statements, significant accounting policies of the circuit clerk, additional information over the cash and investments. And then on page 10, the schedule of changes in assets and liabilities, that provides a little bit more detail of the increases in cash and liabilities and the decreases. And the liabilities are broken out by the different types of fines and fees that they collect and distribute. Beginning on page 13 is report J, the annual financial report. This template is established by the administrative office of the Illinois courts, and they require this to be reported for every fiscal year. It provides a little more detail over the type of receipts and the type of disbursements that are made by the circuit clerk's office. Starting on page 26 is our examination report over the circuit clerk's compliance with the laws and regulations. And within those, we identified 2 non-compliance. And I'll go through those in more detail as well. The material weaknesses, these are pretty similar to what we have reported as a county overall. The circuit clerk, we recommend that they prepare a year-end trial balance in a format. There's a format recommended by the administrative offices. And then we recommend that they perform monthly bank reconciliations using a complete listing of outstanding checks. So the auditing response noted that the listing of outstanding checks comes from 2 different accounting systems, and they're working to address that and combine them into 1 listing of outstanding checks. The second one is the segregation of duties. As we talked about, we identified a segregation of duties within the circuit clerk's office. The individual has the ability to collect receipts, make disbursements, perform bank reconciliations. So I believe that the circuit clerk doesn't always assign duties to that same person, and they're working to take measures to implement more cross-training and additional job duties. So while the same person might not necessarily do those processes, they still have the ability to do that, which still still has risk to it. The third one, the significant deficiency relating to the error in the fines and fees requirements. Some of them are due to oversight and some are due to judicial order. And I believe Circuit Clerk has a similar response that they're working with the state's attorney to make sure that all the fines and fees are issued in accordance with statute. And the last one is the outstanding bond report. They have outstanding bonds for various accounts that are indicated as closed. So we recommend that they review those cases to determine the proper disposal of those deposits. And I believe that the response is that they're waiting on judicial instruction and approval and working on the research and processing for those. We also performed audits over the circuit clerk for 2016 and 2015. And so those reports are set up similar to 2017, and the findings are consistent with 2017 as well. Any questions?
I don't have any. I know you had a jump in your lap. Not our intention,
No.
but we appreciate the thorough report. I do. If anybody's got any questions, speak up. But it looks like, that we're on schedule for the next audit, be on time, everything done, and
Correct.
I think general public knows, we had access to this before today, and how we did our responses, and things will be corrected. So, appreciate your hard work and effort in a short period of time.
Your firm does a lot of municipal audits, correct?
Correct. So yeah, we've seen these findings in other areas, other municipalities too. So.
Well, we have stated all along that we're not in compliance with a lot of things. We know that.
Mm-hmm.
And have been criticized for people we put on staff, but that's the very reason. There's so many things that, several things already that we've asked for and been refused, and no, we're not compliant. And but like I said, I promise you that's going to change.
It takes time.
Yep, well, I know, it does. Angie, you got anything you want to add to?
Nope.
And I think we were discussing another audit with you, how we're going to proceed on that and so forth.
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
Could be.
Some procedures.
No? Good. Thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Next on the agenda, we have a resolution appointing a member of the Southern Fire Regional Planning District and Development Commission. First off, I'd like to thank Sherry for previously serving on this and agreeing to continue to serve. We appreciate that very much. This term will expire December of 2019. Maybe you want to continue to keep going then too, so we'll see. Again, I submit this resolution for approval. Get a motion. Or Sherry for another year.
I'm sorry, who did first?
Max needs to
Yeah.
Max made a
I do?
motion.
Okay. It's one of my job too. Okay, I might have a motion. Good point.
And then who second?
I'll say it.
Okay. Commissioner Pitts,
Yay.
Mr. Toller,
Yes.
Commissioner Miller,
Yes.
Commissioner Gould.
Then we have a resolution, to appoint a member to the Shawnee Development Council. Bobby Kohler Jr. has been serving on that. His term has expired and continues to serve. He has agreed to continue. We appreciate that and the job he does. Very excellent. So I make a motion to appoint Bobby Kohler Jr. to this position. Second.
Commissioner Pitts,
Yes.
Commissioner Toller,
Abstain.
Commissioner Miller,
Yes.
Commissioner Gould.
Yes.
Okay, we have 4 separate resolutions pertaining to, sale of delinquent property held by the county trustee. This is kind of normal happening this time of year. I don't remember last year how many we had, if this is a low amount or, I don't know.
It's relatively low, yes,
I thought
but
it
we
was.
have, each year there are less properties because some go. So basically in another 3 years, we'll see a significant increase.
You also made a hard attempt to try to get some of these resolved before this.
Right,
also.
right.
The first one is partial number 14-00-07-789-790, one Garcia. I don't know, it's the person involved. Can I have a motion to pass this resolution?
I'll make the motion.
Commissioner Pitts,
Yes.
Commissioner Toller,
Yes.
Commissioner Miller,
Yes.
Commissioner Gould.
The second sale is parcel number 14-00-08-735 to Evan L. Betts, B-E-T-T-S. I get a motion to accept that bid.
Commissioner Pitts,
Yes.
Commissioner Toller,
Yes.
Mr. Miller,
Yes.
Commissioner Gould.
The third one is parcel number 14-10-605 to a Ronald Fisher. Need a motion to accept this bid, please. I'll make the motion.
I'll second.
Mr. Pitts,
Yes.
Mr. Toller,
Yes.
Mr. Miller,
Yes.
Commissioner Gould.
The final one is parcel number 05-314-A to Christine and Mitchell Teller. I need a motion to accept that. I'll make the motion.
I'll second.
Commissioner Pitts,
Yes.
Mr. Toller,
Yes.
Mr. Miller,
Yes.
Commissioner Gould.
Yes.
Questions on that? Last item on the agenda is Platinum Elections. I think Lance had initiated this presentation to give us an update, see where we are, what we can do, where we're going. Mr. J. Bennett III.
You guys want to take a break at all, or do you want to continue?
Yeah, let's take a short break. Since we've been here quite a while, if you don't care, we'll take
Yep, I haven't followed up
a 5-minute break.
an audit in a long time.